My name is David. I just turned 65. I'm a retired architect who takes care of my 86-year-old mother, Margaret. 3 months ago, Mom received her Social Security back payment. $59,743. Every penny of her life savings went into a silver SUV. Her final dream after 63 years of work. Mom, where's your car? I asked that October morning, staring at our empty driveway. It's right there, dear, she said, pointing to nothing. No, Mom, it's not. In that moment, I knew. My sister Claire, who had moved back home 6 months ago claiming she wanted to help, had struck again. I'd found my car keys missing the night before, and a sinking feeling had been growing in my stomach ever since. That's when my phone buzzed. A photo from the police. Mom's beautiful SUV wrapped around a telephone pole, completely destroyed. Claire had stolen what she thought were my keys at 3 in the morning, but she'd actually taken Mom's car. She'd been drinking and crashed it. Stop accusing Claire, Mom snapped when I told her. She would never do that. But Claire had been doing exactly that for months, even before the car crash. She'd been forging Mom's checks to withdraw cash. She hid insurance documents. She told everyone that Mom was getting confused about money, so she needed to manage everything. What happens when the daughter your mother loves and protects most is the one stealing her dreams and retirement fund? What happens when no one believes the truth? If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now let's get started. The morning fog pressed against the kitchen window like a wet gray blanket. David stood at the granite island, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. The pill organizer sat open before him. Blue capsules for blood pressure. White ones for cholesterol. The small compartments waited like tiny graves for their daily burden. His fingers moved with the precision of his old architect days. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, each slot filled with mathematical certainty. The morning routine that had kept him steady since retirement 3 years ago. But something felt wrong. The silver key fob. It should be right here, next to his architect's scale. David's eyes swept the counter. Coffee maker. Yesterday's mail. His worn leather wallet with the Medicare card tucked inside. But no keys. The front door slammed. Footsteps clicked across the hardwood floor. Too fast. Too sharp. Good morning, Claire's voice carried from the hallway. But her tone held something else. Something that made David's shoulders tighten. She appeared in the doorway. Her heels clicked against the floor like a nervous clock. The smell of peppermint gum couldn't quite mask something else. Anxiety. Fear. Maybe both. Did you move the car, David? Claire's eyes darted to the empty spot on the counter. I thought I heard it start around 3 in the morning. David's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. 3 in the morning. The pills in his hands suddenly felt heavier. I didn't touch them. His voice stayed level. Controlled. Why are your shoes covered in mud? Claire looked down. Her black pumps bore traces of wet earth. Fresh earth. The kind that sticks to shoes in the early morning hours when the dew is still heavy. I was checking the garden sprinklers. She bent to wipe the mud away. But her hands shook. Just slightly. Just enough. David had seen those hands shake before. 20 years ago, when their father's watch went missing. The same tremor. The same quick movements trying to clean away evidence. The coffee maker hissed behind him. Steam rose in the cool air. The sound filled the silence between them like white noise covering a secret. Claire. David's voice dropped lower. Where are my keys? How would I know? You probably put them somewhere and forgot. She moved to the refrigerator. Opened it. Closed it. Opened it again. You're getting older, David. Memory isn't what it used to be. The words hit like small stones. Each one carefully aimed. She was deflecting. Building distance. Creating doubt where none should exist. David walked to the window. Through the fog, he could make out shapes in the driveway. His old Honda Civic sat where it always did. But the space next to it gaped empty. The space where Margaret's new SUV should be parked. His stomach dropped. Claire. He turned around slowly. Where is Mom's car? Her face went blank. Too blank. The expression of someone trying very hard to look innocent. What do you mean? It's probably. She gestured vaguely toward the window. Maybe Mom moved it. Mom doesn't drive at night. You know that. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times. Each note hung in the air like an accusation. David watched Claire's face in the morning light. The same face that had lied about broken vases and missing money their whole childhood. The same face that now lived in their mother's house, sleeping in the guest room, supposedly helping with care. But David handled all the medical appointments. David managed the pills. David paid the bills. What exactly was Claire helping with? The answer crept up his spine like cold water. I need those keys, Claire. I told you, I don't have them. But she backed toward the door as she spoke. Maybe you should check your pockets. Your jacket. You know how you are about losing things. She was good at this. Turning his reasonable concern into evidence of his failing memory. Making him question what he knew to be true. But David had spent 40 years reading blueprints. He understood structure, foundation, weight distribution, and right now, Claire's story wouldn't support its own weight. The house settled around them. Old wood expanding in the morning warmth. Familiar sounds that usually brought comfort. But today they felt like whispers. Like the house itself was keeping secrets. David's phone buzzed on the counter. A text message. From Margaret. Good morning, dear. I can't wait to drive to the lake today. My beautiful car. The words glowed on the screen like tiny accusations. Margaret's beautiful car. The one she'd bought with her Social Security back payment. The windfall she'd waited 3 years to receive. Her independence. Her pride. Her final gift to herself after a lifetime of sacrifice. And it was gone. David looked at Claire. Really looked at her. The woman who had failed at 3 different careers. Who had borrowed money from their parents more times than he could count. Who had moved back home 6 months ago, claiming she needed to help with mom's care. But Margaret didn't need much care. She was 86 but sharp. Mobile. Capable. What she needed was protection. Protection from the daughter who saw her not as a mother but as an opportunity. Claire. David's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. I'm going to ask you one more time. Where are my keys? She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin. The defiant gesture he remembered from childhood. The one she used when caught red-handed but too stubborn to admit it. I don't have your stupid keys, David. And frankly, I'm getting tired of your accusations. Mom asked me to help, not to be interrogated every morning by her paranoid son. The words hung between them like smoke. Toxic and choking. David felt something shift in his chest. A wall building, brick by brick, between him and the sister he'd once protected. Once believed in, once trusted. But trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. Not when Margaret's happiness hung in the balance. Not when $60,000 worth of hope was missing from the driveway. Not when Claire's muddy shoes told a story her words refused to acknowledge. The fog outside began to lift. Slowly, reluctantly, like the truth David was finally beginning to see. The morning sun cut through the gray, casting sharp shadows across the kitchen floor. Light and dark, truth and lies, as clearly separated as the pills in his weekly organizer. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. 7 days of medicine to keep the body running. But what medicine could cure a family's poison? David closed the pill organizer with a soft click. The sound echoed in the quiet kitchen like a door shutting. Like a decision being made. Like the first step down a path he'd hoped never to walk. The path toward the truth about his sister. And the terrible thing she had done in the darkness before dawn. The morning air bit at David's face as he stepped onto the porch. The fog had lifted enough to reveal the truth he'd been dreading. The driveway stretched before him like an accusation. Gray concrete, oil stains from years of faithful service, and a gaping emptiness where $60,000 of hope should have been parked. His breath came out in small white puffs. October in Chicago always carried winter's warning, but this cold felt different. It came from inside, from the hollow space where trust used to live. The Honda Civic sat alone on the right side. Modest, reliable, 13 years old but still running strong. The car of a man who understood the difference between want and need. Between flash and substance. But Margaret's SUV. Her beautiful, gleaming testament to a lifetime of hard work. Gone. David walked down the 3 concrete steps his own hands had poured 15 years ago. Each footfall echoed in the quiet suburban morning. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson's dog began its daily bark symphony. Normal sounds. Normal morning. Everything exactly as it should be. Except for the void in his driveway. Except for the sick certainty growing in his stomach. A piece of paper caught his eye. White against the dark welcome mat. Crumpled, bearing the unmistakable footprint of someone in a hurry. Someone who had stepped on it without caring what it was or whom it belonged to. David bent down. His knees protested with their morning stiffness. But the ache was nothing compared to what he felt when he smoothed out the paper. Social Security Administration. Official correspondence. The letterhead that had brought such joy to this house just 2 weeks ago. Dear Margaret Davidson, the letter began. This notice confirms your retroactive benefit payment in the amount of $59,743. 3 years. Margaret had waited 3 years for this payment. A bureaucratic error that had cost her nearly $60,000 in benefits she'd rightfully earned. 3 years of phone calls, forms, appeals, fighting a system that seemed designed to exhaust the elderly into giving up. But Margaret hadn't given up. And neither had David. They'd won. Finally, the check had arrived with ceremony. Margaret had held it like a newborn baby. Tears in her eyes. Victory in her voice. I'm going to buy a car, David. A real car. Not some old thing that breaks down every winter. Something beautiful. Something that says I matter. And she had. The silver SUV with leather seats and a sunroof. Navigation system. Heated mirrors. All the luxury she'd denied herself for 8 decades of putting everyone else first. The car that was now missing from his driveway. The car that Claire had access to. The car that. David? Is that you out there? Margaret's voice drifted through the screen door. Sweet. Hopeful. Completely unaware that her dream was currently wrapped around a telephone pole somewhere in Chicago. Because David was certain now. Claire hadn't just taken the car for a joyride. The mud on her shoes. The tremor in her hands. The way she'd avoided his eyes. These weren't the signs of someone who'd simply borrowed a car. These were the signs of someone who'd destroyed it. The front door opened with its familiar squeak. Margaret appeared, her silver walker catching the morning light. At 86, she still moved with purpose. Still dressed carefully each morning. Still believed that today might bring something wonderful. Oh good, she said, her face lighting up like Christmas morning. I was hoping you'd check on my beautiful car. Is it ready for our drive to the lake? David's heart broke into several small pieces. Margaret had been talking about this drive for weeks. Ever since the car arrived. She wanted to see the lake where she'd honeymooned with David's father 62 years ago. The place where they'd scattered his ashes 5 years later. The place she hadn't visited since because she'd never owned a car nice enough to make the journey feel special. Today's the day, isn't it? Margaret continued, clutching the Social Security notice to her chest like a talisman. My car and I are going to have such an adventure. The paper trembled in her hands. Not from age or infirmity, but from pure excitement. From the joy of a woman who had finally gotten something beautiful for herself. David looked at the empty driveway. Then at the oil stain where the SUV had been parked. Fresh tire tracks led toward the street. Made sometime in the night when honest people were sleeping. When honest people weren't stealing their mother's dreams. The car's not here, Mom. The words came out before he could stop them. Blunt. Truthful. Devastating. Margaret's smile faltered. Not here? But where? I don't understand. David watched confusion replace joy on his mother's face. Watched her grip the walker tighter. Watched her world tilt off its axis because her daughter had decided that a gambling debt was more important than an old woman's happiness. It's at the shop, David heard himself say. The lie tasted like ashes. Just a quick polish. They wanted it to be perfect for your big day. The relief on Margaret's face was immediate. Complete. Heartbreaking. Oh, how thoughtful. I knew you'd take good care of it. You always take such good care of everything. She patted his arm with her free hand. When will it be ready? Another lie required. Another brick in the wall David was building between truth and Margaret's breaking heart. This afternoon. They'll have it back this afternoon. But even as he said it, David knew there would be no car this afternoon. No car tomorrow. No car ever again. Because Claire had taken more than just keys and metal and leather. She'd taken Margaret's independence. She'd taken her final adventure. She'd taken the tangible proof that a lifetime of hard work could still yield something beautiful. The neighbor's dog barked louder now, as if sensing the tension in the air. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson emerged to retrieve her morning paper. She waved. David waved back automatically, playing the role of the normal neighbor on a normal morning. But nothing about this morning was normal. Margaret turned to go back inside, humming softly to herself. The melody of someone anticipating joy. The sound cut through David like a rusty blade. "I'll make sandwiches for our picnic," she called over her shoulder. "Egg salad, your father's favorite." The screen door closed behind her with a gentle whisper. David stood alone on the porch, holding the crumpled Social Security notice. The paper that represented 3 years of fighting. 3 years of hope. 3 years of looking forward to this moment. This moment that Claire had destroyed with her selfishness. This moment that would never come. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last wisps of fog. The suburban street revealed itself in sharp detail. Neat lawns, painted mailboxes, the architecture of middle-class dreams built one careful decision at a time. But in this driveway, someone had made a different kind of decision. Someone had chosen theft over honesty. Someone had chosen destruction over family. Someone had chosen her own desperation over an old woman's simple dream of driving to a lake. David folded the Social Security notice carefully. Smoothed its wrinkles. This piece of paper was evidence now. Evidence of what Margaret had rightfully earned. Evidence of what she'd lost. Evidence of what Claire had taken in the dark hours before dawn. Inside the house, he could hear Margaret moving around the kitchen. Opening cabinets. Running water. Making sandwiches for a picnic that would never happen. Preparing for an adventure that had died somewhere on a Chicago street while she slept peacefully in her bed. David looked at his Honda Civic. 13 years old but honest. Paid for with his own money. Driven with respect for its limitations and gratitude for its service. The car that would have to carry them to the lake now. If Margaret could accept the disappointment. If she could understand why her dream car had become just another broken promise. If her heart could survive another betrayal from the daughter she'd trusted with her house, her savings, and her faith. The October wind picked up, scattering dead leaves across the empty driveway. They skittered and danced over the oil stains, over the tire tracks, over the place where Margaret's silver SUV should have been sitting in the morning sun. David walked back up the porch steps. Each footfall heavier than the last. Inside, Margaret was humming louder now, her voice carrying the joy of someone who believed beautiful things were still possible. Someone who didn't yet know that the most beautiful thing in her life had just become the most painful. Someone who trusted her children to protect her dreams instead of destroy them. David paused at the screen door. Inside lay the conversation he didn't want to have. The truth he didn't want to tell. The moment when Margaret would learn that her own daughter had valued her own needs more than her mother's happiness. But outside lay something worse. Outside lay the certainty that Claire was somewhere in the city, dealing with the consequences of whatever she'd done in the dark. Outside lay the knowledge that this was just the beginning. Because when people steal from family, they don't stop at cars. They don't stop until everything is gone. The Maple Leaf Cafe sat on Oak Street like a stage set for suburban drama. Red brick exterior, hunter green awnings, the kind of place where middle-aged women gathered to discuss their children's achievements and their husbands' failures over bottomless mimosas and eggs Benedict. David pulled into the parking lot at 11:30 sharp. The Honda's engine ticked as it cooled. Through the restaurant's large windows, he could see Claire at her usual table. The round one in the corner. The one that offered the best view of the entire dining room and everyone who entered it. She wasn't alone. 4 other women clustered around the white tablecloth like birds of prey examining fresh kill. All perfectly coiffed. All wearing the uniform of suburban success designer handbags, manicured nails, and the kind of jewelry that whispered money rather than shouting it. Claire's real estate friends. The women who had watched her career crumble over the past 3 years. Who had witnessed her slide from luxury home specialist to desperate agent taking any listing that paid commission. Who knew about the gambling, the debt, the mounting pressure that had driven her back to her mother's house like a defeated general retreating to a childhood fort. David sat in his car for a moment, watching through the window. Claire gestured animatedly, her hands dancing through the air as she told some story. The other women leaned in, their faces bright with the particular joy that comes from hearing someone else's drama while sipping $70 brunch wine. But what story was Claire telling? And how much of it was true? David reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers found the reassuring rectangle of his Medicare card nestled in his wallet. The card that had opened doors to specialists when Margaret needed them. The card that represented stability. Planning. The kind of careful life management that Claire had always scorned as boring. The same boring reliability that had paid for this house. This driveway. This life that Claire was systematically destroying. He walked across the parking lot, his footsteps sharp against the asphalt. October wind carried the scent of burning leaves and approaching winter. Normal autumn smells. Normal seasonal changes. Everything proceeding as it should except for the cancer of dishonesty eating through his family. The restaurant door chimed as he entered. Conversations buzzed around linen-covered tables. The clink of silverware against china. The soft pop of champagne corks. The soundtrack of people with money and time and the luxury to pretend their problems could be solved with expensive food and stronger drinks. Claire saw him immediately. Her laugh died mid-syllable. Her face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, guilt, calculation, and finally, defiance. The same progression he'd seen 1,000 times growing up when their parents caught her in increasingly elaborate lies. David. Her voice carried across the dining room like a bell. Too loud, too bright, too everything. Ladies, you remember my brother David. The architect who thinks he's everyone's keeper. The women at the table turned their faces toward him with the coordinated precision of a theater ensemble. Polite smiles that never reached their eyes. The kind of smiles that said they already knew exactly what kind of man he was supposed to be in Claire's narrative. The overprotective brother. The killjoy. The man who couldn't understand that sometimes you had to live a little. Even if living a little meant stealing from your own mother. Claire. David approached the table slowly. Deliberately. The way he'd once approached construction sites where the foundation was questionable. We need to talk. Oh, we're talking. Claire lifted her mimosa glass in a mock toast. Ladies, David here thinks that our 86-year-old mother should be treated like a child. He monitors her every move. Controls her every decision. Isn't that precious? The women made appropriate murmuring sounds. Sympathetic noises directed at Claire. Poor Claire, dealing with such a controlling sibling. Poor Claire, trying to help her mother while her brother micromanaged every detail. David felt the familiar burn of manipulation in his chest. Claire had always been gifted at this. At taking her own sins and making them his fault. At positioning herself as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of destruction. Where's Mom's car, Claire? The question cut through the restaurant chatter like a blade. Conversations at nearby tables slowed. Ears turned their way. Nothing drew suburban attention quite like family drama played out in public. Claire's smile never wavered. Mom's car is perfectly fine, David. Stop being so paranoid. I asked where it is. And I told you it's fine. Claire turned to her friends with an exaggerated eye roll. You see what I have to deal with? He thinks I'm going to steal Mom's precious SUV and drive it to Vegas or something. The women laughed on cue. But the laughter had a nervous edge. The kind of uncomfortable sound people make when they're witnessing something that isn't actually funny. David reached into his wallet. Slid out his Medicare card. The motion was deliberate, precise. The kind of gesture that said he was done playing games. Ladies, he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority he'd once used with construction crews who weren't following safety protocols. I'm going to need a moment alone with my sister. The words hung in the air like smoke. Heavy with implication. Dangerous to breathe. David, really? Claire started. Now. The single word carried enough weight to shift the atmosphere at the table. The women exchanged glances. Quick. Nervous. The kind of looks that said they'd suddenly remembered urgent appointments elsewhere. Well, we should probably, one of them began. Yes, we should go, another agreed quickly. They gathered their purses with unseemly haste. Dropped $20 bills on the table without calculating the actual cost. Muttered goodbye platitudes without making eye contact. Within 30 seconds, David and Claire were alone at the round table with its white cloth and scattered crumbs and the debris of interrupted lies. Claire stared at him across the table. Her defiance had crystallized into something harder. Something that looked almost like hatred. You have no right to embarrass me like that. I have every right to ask about Mom's car. It's at the shop. I told you that. Which shop? The question landed like a physical blow. Claire's face went blank. Not the careful blank of someone trying to look innocent. The terrified blank of someone who'd been caught in a lie and was desperately searching for an exit. What does it matter which shop? Because I'm going to call them. David pulled out his phone. Placed it on the table between them like evidence in a trial. The screen reflected the overhead lights. Bright, unforgiving, ready to expose whatever truth Claire was hiding. David, don't be ridiculous. Give me the name of the shop, Claire. I don't remember exactly. The name, Claire. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Around them, the restaurant continued its normal rhythm. Servers cleared tables. New customers were seated. The world moved forward while their corner table became the epicenter of a family earthquake. Claire's hands trembled as she reached for her purse. The same tremor David had noticed that morning. The same unconscious tell that had given her away when she'd stolen their father's watch. When she'd forged their mother's signature on checks. When she'd lied about the gambling debts that had cost her the real estate office. But this tremor was worse. This tremor spoke of consequences that went beyond money or pride. This tremor spoke of police reports and insurance claims and the kind of trouble that couldn't be fixed with tears and apologies and promises to do better. There was an accident. The words came out so quietly David almost missed them. 3 words that confirmed everything he'd feared. 3 words that explained the mud on her shoes and the missing car and the way she'd avoided his eyes that morning. What kind of accident? A small one. Just a fender bender. Nothing serious. But David could see the lie in her eyes. Could read the truth in the set of her shoulders. Could feel the magnitude of what she wasn't telling him. Claire. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. What did you do? She looked away. Out the window at the parking lot where normal people were living normal lives. Where families weren't destroying themselves one lie at a time. Where mothers' dreams didn't die in twisted metal and broken glass. It wasn't my fault. The words came out in a rush. There was a deer. It ran right out in front of me. I couldn't stop. I tried to stop but the road was wet and... Were you drinking? The question hung between them like a loaded gun. David already knew the answer. Had known it the moment he'd smelled the peppermint on her breath that morning. Had known it when he'd seen the tremor in her hands. Had known it because this was Claire. And Claire always made the worst possible choice in any situation. I had 1 drink. Maybe 2. But I wasn't drunk. I swear I wasn't drunk. Jesus, Claire. Don't lecture me, David. Don't you dare lecture me. You have no idea what my life is like. You have no idea what it's like to watch everything fall apart while your perfect brother judges every move you make. The words came out like venom. Years of resentment and jealousy and self-pity distilled into pure poison. Claire's face had gone red with anger and shame and the particular fury of someone who knew she was wrong but couldn't admit it. I know what it's like to clean up your messes, David said quietly. I know what it's like to pay your debts and cover your lies and explain to Mom why her daughter keeps disappointing her. I never asked you to. You never asked me not to. The truth of it hit Claire like a slap. She sat back in her chair, the fight going out of her like air from a punctured tire. For a moment, she looked exactly like the little girl who used to come to David's room after their parents had punished her for lying. The little girl who'd cried in his arms and promised to do better. The little girl who'd never learned that promises weren't magic spells. That good intentions couldn't undo bad choices. That some mistakes couldn't be fixed with tears and regret. Where's the car now, Claire? The impound lot. Her voice had gone small. Defeated. They towed it after the accident. How bad? Bad. How bad? Total loss. The words hit David like a physical blow. Total loss. Not just dents and scratches. Not just expensive repairs. Complete destruction. The end of Margaret's dream. The death of her independence. The final punctuation mark on a lifetime of sacrifice. The insurance won't cover it. Claire's voice was barely a whisper now. I wasn't supposed to be driving. The policy doesn't cover unauthorized drivers. Especially unauthorized drivers who've been drinking. David felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place. The final domino in a chain of destruction that started with Claire's selfishness and ended with Margaret's broken heart. No car. No insurance. No way to replace what had been lost. And Margaret, sitting at home making sandwiches for a picnic that would never happen. Humming to herself because she believed her beautiful car was getting polished. Because she trusted her children to protect her happiness instead of destroy it. David stood up slowly. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, as if the ground itself had shifted. I have to tell her. David, wait. She's making sandwiches, Claire. She's planning our drive to the lake. She's humming because she thinks her dream is coming true. Maybe we can figure something out. Maybe we can. There is no we. David's voice cut through her desperate words like ice. You did this. You made this choice. You destroyed her happiness because you couldn't live with your own consequences. He turned to leave. Behind him, Claire was crying now. Real tears for the first time that day. But David couldn't feel sorry for her. Couldn't summon even a whisper of sympathy. Because somewhere across town, an 86-year-old woman was humming love songs while making egg salad sandwiches for a picnic with her son. A picnic in her beautiful car. A picnic that would never happen because her daughter had decided that a few drinks and a moment of selfishness were worth more than a lifetime of dreams. David walked out of the Maple Leaf Cafe into the October afternoon. The sun was shining. The air smelled of autumn leaves and possibility. But inside his chest, everything felt like winter. David sat in his study as darkness settled over the house like a heavy blanket. The lamp on his desk cast a weak pool of yellow light across scattered papers. Bills, medical reports, the careful documentation of a life lived responsibly. But responsibility felt like a joke now. His phone lay face down on the mahogany surface. Silent, but somehow still menacing, as if it contained more bad news waiting to be revealed. More evidence of how completely Claire had destroyed everything. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times. Each note echoed through the quiet house like a funeral bell. Outside, suburban Chicago settled into its evening rhythm. Porch lights flickering on. Television screens glowing blue behind curtains. The comforting patterns of ordinary families living ordinary lives. Lives where daughters didn't steal from their mothers. Lives where dreams didn't die in twisted metal and broken glass. David's hand moved toward the phone, then stopped. He'd been avoiding it for hours. Ever since he'd come home from the restaurant and found Margaret in the kitchen, still humming, still making preparations for their imaginary picnic. He couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth. Couldn't shatter her happiness with the reality of what Claire had done. So he'd mumbled something about the car needing more work. Promised they'd go to the lake tomorrow instead. Watched her face fall with disappointment before brightening again with hope. Tomorrow then, she'd said, patting his arm. My beautiful car, and I can wait one more day. The memory cut through him like a blade. Margaret's faith. Her endless capacity to believe that tomorrow would be better. Her trust in her children to make things right. Trust that had been repaid with theft and lies and destruction. The phone buzzed against the desk. David's stomach clenched. Unknown number. Text message. The kind of communication that brought bad news in the middle of the night. He turned the phone over slowly. As if moving carefully could somehow change what was about to be revealed. The message loaded. A photograph filled the screen. Color. High resolution. Unmistakably real. Margaret's silver SUV. Or what was left of it. The front end had collapsed like an accordion. Hood bent skyward at an impossible angle. Windshield spider webbed with cracks that caught the camera's flash like a broken constellation. The driver's side door hung open, revealing the leather interior Margaret had been so proud of. Leather now stained dark with something David didn't want to identify. But it was the small detail in the passenger seat that stopped his breathing. The pill organizer. His pill organizer. The one he'd filled so carefully that morning. Monday through Sunday. Blue capsules and white capsules arranged with mathematical precision. The organizer was open now. Its contents scattered across the tan leather like confetti. Like evidence of a normal morning routine destroyed by one terrible decision. A second text appeared. Found your business card in the glove compartment. Thought you should see this. Insurance adjuster will be in touch. Sorry for your loss. No signature. No explanation. Just the brutal facts delivered by someone who dealt with car crashes every day. Someone for whom twisted metal and broken dreams were just another day at the office. David stared at the image until his eyes watered. The destruction was complete. Total. The kind of damage that spoke of high speed and alcohol and the split second when everything goes wrong at once. Margaret's dream, reduced to scrap metal and police reports. Her independence, destroyed by her daughter's selfishness. Her final gift to herself, turned into a twisted monument to betrayal. David set the phone down with trembling hands. The study felt smaller suddenly. The walls pressing in, the familiar books and blueprints and architectural awards meaningless in the face of what Claire had done. $60,000. Gone. Margaret's happiness, shattered. Her trust in her daughter, broken beyond repair. And David who had promised to protect her. David who had handled her finances and managed her medications and sworn to keep her safe. David had failed in the most fundamental way possible. He'd let Claire into the house, into their lives, into their mother's heart. The desk lamp flickered, casting shifting shadows across the wreckage photos on his phone. In the unsteady light, the images looked even worse, like something from a nightmare rather than reality. But this was reality. This was what happened when you trusted someone who had proven themselves untrustworthy. When you believed promises from someone who had broken every promise they'd ever made. When you hoped that family meant something more than opportunity. A soft knock at the study door made David look up. Margaret stood in the doorway, her walker catching the lamplight. She wore her blue nightgown, the one with tiny flowers that she'd bought for herself last Christmas. A rare indulgence for a woman who usually wore her clothes until they fell apart. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly. "I keep thinking about our drive tomorrow. About seeing the lake again after all these years." David's throat closed. The words he needed to say stuck like broken glass. How do you tell an 86-year-old woman that her daughter has destroyed her dreams? How do you explain that the car she'd saved for, planned for, dreamed about, was currently sitting in a police impound lot in pieces? "Mom, I know it's silly," Margaret continued, moving slowly into the room. "But I feel like a young woman again. Like anything is possible. Isn't it wonderful what a beautiful car can do? How it can make you feel like you matter." The words hit David like physical blows, each one perfectly aimed at the part of him that was supposed to protect her from pain like this. The part that was supposed to keep her safe from the kind of betrayal that destroyed faith in family. "Sit down, Mom." Something in his voice made her freeze. The happiness drained from her face like water from a broken cup. She looked at him with the sudden clarity of someone who had survived 86 years by learning to read danger in people's voices. "What's wrong? Please sit down." Margaret moved to the leather chair across from his desk. Her movements careful, deliberate, the movements of someone preparing for bad news. Someone who had received enough bad news in her lifetime to recognize its approach. David turned the phone face down again. Couldn't bear to have those images visible while he destroyed his mother's happiness with words. "There was an accident." Margaret's hands tightened on her walker. "What kind of accident?" "Claire was driving your car. Last night. She hit a tree." The silence that followed was complete. Total. As if the house itself was holding its breath. "Is she hurt?" Even now, even after learning that Claire had stolen her car and crashed it. Margaret's first concern was for her daughter's safety. The endless capacity of a mother's love. Even when that love had been betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. "She's fine. But the car," David's voice broke. "Mom, the car is gone." Margaret didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't react with the kind of dramatic emotion that would have been understandable. Instead, she simply closed her eyes and sat very still, as if she was absorbing a blow she'd been expecting her whole life. "How bad?" she asked finally. "Total loss. The insurance won't cover it." Claire wasn't supposed to be driving. Margaret opened her eyes. In the lamplight, they looked ancient. Tired beyond measure. The eyes of someone who had just learned that the people you love most can hurt you the worst. "She took my keys." It wasn't a question. Margaret understood. Had probably understood from the moment David said Claire's name. Had probably known, in the way mothers know things, that her daughter's promises and apologies and claims of wanting to help had been lies from the beginning. Yes, she was drinking. Another statement, not a question. Margaret had lived with Claire's problems long enough to know their patterns. Their inevitable progression from small lies to large betrayals. Yes, Margaret was quiet for a long time. So long that David wondered if she'd fallen asleep. But her eyes were open, staring at something beyond the study walls. Something in her memory or her heart or the place where dreams go to die. I worked for 63 years, she said finally. 63 years of getting up early and coming home tired and putting every penny I could spare into savings. For my family. For emergencies. For the day when I might have something beautiful just for me. Her voice was calm, matter of fact. The voice of someone reciting facts rather than expressing emotion. I waited 3 years for that check. 3 years of phone calls and forms and being treated like I was trying to steal money instead of collect what I'd earned. 3 years of watching my friends buy things for themselves while I waited for what was mine. David wanted to say something. Wanted to offer comfort or hope or some promise that things would be okay. But what comfort could he give? What hope was left? What promise could he make that wouldn't sound like another lie? And when it finally came, Margaret continued, when that check finally arrived, I felt like I'd won the lottery. Not because of the money. Because of what it meant. It meant I mattered. It meant my work had value. It meant I could have something beautiful just for me. She was crying now, not the dramatic sobs of someone overwhelmed by emotion. Just tears running down her cheeks like rain on windows. Quiet tears that somehow hurt worse than screaming would have. $59,743, she whispered. Do you know how many loads of laundry that represents? How many meals cooked? How many floors scrubbed? How many years of putting everyone else first? David did know, had watched his mother sacrifice her own wants and needs for decades. Had seen her wear the same coat for 10 years so she could pay for Claire's college. Had watched her eat less so there would be more food for others. Had witnessed a lifetime of selfless choices that had led to this moment. This moment when her final reward had been stolen by the daughter she'd sacrificed everything for. She didn't mean, David started. Don't. Margaret's voice cut through his words like ice. Don't defend her. Don't make excuses. Don't tell me she didn't mean to destroy the only beautiful thing I've had in 20 years. The finality in her voice stopped David cold. This wasn't anger. This was something deeper. Something that sounded like death. The death of hope. The death of trust. The death of whatever love survived between a mother and daughter after betrayal this complete. I'm going to bed, Margaret said, struggling to her feet. In the morning, I'll call my lawyer. Change my will. Claire won't get another penny from me. Not one penny. She moved toward the door with painful slowness. Each step an effort, as if the weight of what she'd learned had aged her years in minutes. Mom. Good night, David. Thank you for telling me the truth. Even if it came 24 hours too late. She was gone. The study door closed with a soft click. David sat alone in his chair, surrounded by the debris of a family destroyed by greed and selfishness and the terrible arithmetic of betrayal. On his phone, the photos waited. Evidence of destruction that went far beyond twisted metal and broken glass. Evidence of dreams destroyed and trust shattered and love turned to ash. Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the windows, carrying the promise of a long, cold winter. A winter that would begin tomorrow. When Margaret woke up and remembered that her beautiful car was gone. Her daughter was a thief. Her dreams were dead. When she realized that the only beautiful thing she'd ever had just for herself had been stolen by the person she'd loved most in the world. David turned off the desk lamp. Darkness filled the study like water filling a grave. Tomorrow, he would have to start picking up the pieces. Tomorrow, he would have to figure out how to rebuild a life from the rubble of betrayal. Tomorrow, he would have to learn how to live in a world where family meant nothing more than opportunity for destruction. But tonight, he just sat in the dark and listened to the wind and tried to understand how love could be twisted into something so cruel. How trust could become such a dangerous thing. How dreams could die so quickly in the hands of someone who was supposed to protect them. David couldn't sleep. The house felt different in the darkness. Heavy with secrets that had finally been revealed. Poisoned by truths that changed everything. He found himself in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, standing exactly where he'd stood 12 hours earlier when this nightmare began. The granite island, the coffee maker, the empty space where the keys should have been. But now he knew the story behind the missing keys. Now he understood the magnitude of what Claire had done. The careful cruelty of it. The calculated betrayal that went beyond mere theft into something approaching evil. The refrigerator hummed in the darkness. A normal sound. A reminder that some things continued working even when everything else fell apart. Even when families destroyed themselves. Even when trust died. David walked to the sliding door that led to the back deck. Through the glass, he could see the yard he'd helped Margaret design 15 years ago. The flower beds she'd planted with her own hands. The small vegetable garden that still produced tomatoes and beans despite her advancing age. Everything neat, orderly, cared for, the exact opposite of the chaos Claire had brought into their lives. But standing in the dark, David began to remember other things. Patterns he'd been too close to see clearly. Signs he'd ignored because acknowledging them would have required action he wasn't ready to take. 1995, Margaret's 70th birthday. David had designed and built a new front porch as a surprise. He'd spent weeks planning it, calculating load requirements, selecting materials, creating something beautiful and functional that would last for decades. The day before the big reveal, he'd come by to do final touch-ups. Found Claire in Margaret's bedroom, rifling through the jewelry box on the dresser. "What are you doing?" Mom asked me to find her pearls. "For the party tomorrow." But Margaret's pearls were in the safe deposit box at the bank. Had been for years. David knew because he'd driven her there to put them away after their father's funeral. Claire had been stealing. Even then. Even when Margaret was healthy and alert and fully capable of protecting herself. But David hadn't said anything. Had pretended to believe the lie because confronting it would have meant admitting that his sister was a thief. That his family was broken. That the pretty picture of sibling loyalty he'd built in his mind was just another form of architecture. Beautiful from the outside but structurally unsound. 2003. Claire's second bankruptcy. She'd come to David with tears in her eyes and desperation in her voice, begging him not to tell Margaret how bad things had gotten. "I'll pay it back. Every penny. I just need time to get back on my feet." David had co-signed a loan. $25,000. Money he couldn't afford to lose but couldn't bring himself to refuse. Because Claire was family. Because you helped family, even when family had proven themselves unworthy of help. She'd never paid back a dime. But worse, she'd used David's good credit to secure other loans. Forged his name on applications. Stolen his financial identity the way she'd stolen everything else. When David discovered the fraud, Claire had cried again. Apologized again. Promised again. "I was desperate, David. You don't understand what it's like to be drowning while watching everyone else swim." And again, David had said nothing to Margaret. Had quietly cleaned up the mess. Paid the bills. Absorbed the financial damage because protecting Margaret from the truth seemed more important than protecting himself from Claire's lies. 2008. The real estate market crashed, taking Claire's third career attempt with it. She'd lost her license for misrepresenting property values. Lost her apartment. Lost what little credibility remained from her previous failures. Margaret had welcomed her home with open arms. "Family takes care of family," she'd said, setting up the guest room with fresh sheets and flowers from her garden. "Claire just needs time to figure things out." But Claire hadn't been figuring things out. She'd been planning, watching, learning the rhythms of the household, discovering where important documents were kept, where spare keys were stored, where an elderly woman might be vulnerable to manipulation. David had seen it happening. Had watched Claire position herself as the helpful daughter while gradually taking control of small decisions. Which doctor Margaret should see. Which bills needed immediate attention. Which investments might need to be liquidated for emergency expenses. And David had let it happen. Because stopping it would have required him to admit what Claire really was. Would have forced him to choose between protecting his mother and protecting his illusions about family loyalty. He'd chosen wrong. Again and again, he'd chosen wrong. Standing in the dark kitchen, David finally understood that Claire's theft of the SUV wasn't an impulsive act driven by desperation. It was the culmination of years of planning. The final step in a carefully orchestrated campaign to extract everything of value from Margaret's life. The car had just been the biggest prize. The most obvious target. The symbol of Margaret's independence that Claire needed to destroy in order to complete her control. Because as long as Margaret had her own transportation, she had options. She could go places without Claire's permission. See people without Claire's supervision. Make decisions without Claire's input. The car represented freedom, and free people were harder to manipulate than dependent ones. So Claire had taken the car, had probably planned to disappear with it, sell it somewhere out of state, use the money to pay her gambling debts and start fresh in another city where her reputation hadn't yet caught up with her failures. But the accident had spoiled that plan, had turned simple theft into destruction, had eliminated the possibility of hiding her crime behind more lies and manipulation. Now there was no car to return, no way to claim she'd only borrowed it, no story she could tell that would make this anything other than what it was: a daughter destroying her mother's dreams for her own selfish purposes. The grandfather clock chimed 4 times. David had been standing in the kitchen for an hour, watching the sky slowly lighten through the window. Dawn was coming whether he was ready for it or not. Whether Margaret was ready for it or not. This would be the first morning of her new life. Her life without dreams, without the independence she'd worked 63 years to earn, without the beautiful car that had made her feel like she mattered. Her life knowing that her own daughter had valued gambling debts more than a mother's happiness. David walked back upstairs, paused outside Margaret's bedroom door. He could hear her breathing. Deep, even, the sleep of exhaustion, of a woman whose heart had been broken so completely that unconsciousness was the only escape. She would wake up soon. Would remember, in that terrible moment between sleep and wakefulness, that yesterday hadn't been a nightmare. That her car really was gone. That Claire really had betrayed her. That the beautiful thing she'd bought for herself had been destroyed by the daughter she'd sacrificed everything to raise. And David would have to face her. Would have to see the disappointment in her eyes. Not just disappointment in Claire, but disappointment in him. In the son who had seen the warning signs and chosen to ignore them. Who had enabled Claire's betrayal through his own cowardice. Who had failed in his most fundamental responsibility, protecting his mother from the people who would hurt her. Even when those people were family. Especially when those people were family. Back in his study, David sat at his desk as the sun rose over suburban Chicago. Normal people were starting normal days. Making coffee, reading newspapers, planning their normal problems and normal solutions. But in this house, nothing would ever be normal again. David opened his laptop, began typing, an email to his lawyer, another to his accountant, a third to the insurance company. The practical matters that followed betrayal, the financial damage assessment, the legal implications of theft and fraud, and the systematic destruction of an elderly woman's independence. The architecture of rebuilding a life from rubble. But as he typed, David knew that some things couldn't be rebuilt. Some trust, once broken, could never be repaired. Some betrayals left scars so deep that they changed the fundamental structure of a family forever. Claire had stolen more than a car. She'd stolen Margaret's ability to trust her children. She'd stolen David's belief that family meant something more than opportunity. She'd stolen the possibility that they could ever again be anything more than strangers sharing a house and bitter memories. The sun climbed higher. Normal light for an abnormal day. David continued typing, making lists, creating plans, using the skills that had served him well as an architect. Because even when everything falls apart, someone has to start building again. Even when the foundation is gone, someone has to pour new concrete. Even when the family is broken beyond repair, someone has to protect what's left. Outside, the suburban morning began its familiar rhythm. But inside this house, everything had changed. Forever. The morning light felt different as it streamed through the kitchen window. Harsher somehow, as if the sun itself was exposing truths that had hidden in shadow too long. David stood at the sink, washing the coffee cup Margaret had used last night. Before she learned the truth. Before her world collapsed. The simple white ceramic felt fragile in his hands. Like everything else in this house. Like everything else in their lives. Behind him, the refrigerator hummed its steady rhythm. Normal sounds for an abnormal morning. The first morning of what came after betrayal. The first day of learning to live with the knowledge that family could be the enemy. Margaret hadn't come down yet. David wasn't surprised. Some blows took time to absorb. Some truths required sleep to process. Some betrayals were too large to face immediately. But David couldn't sleep, couldn't rest, couldn't stop the architect's mind from analyzing the structure of what had happened. Looking for patterns, seeking evidence, building a case that would stand up to scrutiny. Because this wasn't just family drama anymore. This was theft, fraud, the systematic exploitation of an elderly woman by someone she trusted. The kind of crime that destroyed lives and sent people to prison. The kind of crime that required evidence. David walked to the pantry where Margaret kept her important documents. Birth certificates, insurance policies, medical records, the careful paperwork of a life lived responsibly. And there, in a manila folder labeled "car," were the documents David needed. The purchase agreement. Margaret's signature, careful and proud. $59,743. Every penny of her Social Security back payment. Her entire windfall invested in independence and joy. The insurance policy. Comprehensive coverage. Protection against theft, vandalism, collision. Everything except unauthorized drivers under the influence of alcohol. That exclusion was clearly stated in Section 12, subsection 4. The fine print that insurance companies used to avoid paying claims. The fine print that made Claire's theft even more devastating. David spread the documents across the kitchen table. The evidence of Margaret's dreams and Claire's destruction. The paper trail that would determine whether justice was possible or if Claire would escape consequences once again. His phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. This is Detective Morrison, Chicago PD. We have your sister in custody. Need to speak with you about the vehicle. Can you come down to the station this morning? David stared at the message. In custody. The words that meant Claire's lies had finally caught up with her. That the careful manipulation she'd perfected over decades had finally failed her. That the law had stepped in where family had failed. Another text followed immediately. Also found these items in the vehicle. Can you identify? A photo loaded. Personal effects scattered across an evidence table. Margaret's prescription sunglasses. The pill organizer David had filled so carefully yesterday morning. A gas station receipt timestamp 3:17 a.m. And something else. Something that made David's blood run cold. Margaret's checkbook. Open to a page with several checks missing. The stubs showed amounts $500, $800, $1,200, all made out to cash. All signed with Margaret's distinctive handwriting. Except Margaret never withdrew cash in amounts like that. Never wrote checks without recording the purpose. Never left her checkbook where someone else could access it. Claire hadn't just stolen the car. She'd been stealing money for months. Forging Margaret's signature. Using her own mother as a personal bank account while pretending to care for her. David's hands shook as he photographed the insurance documents. Evidence that would prove the car was stolen. That Claire had no right to drive it. That the accident was the result of a crime, not a mistake. The front door opened. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, careful, the sound of someone trying not to disturb others. David? Margaret's voice. Smaller than usual, aged by a single night of terrible truth. In the kitchen, Mom. She appeared in the doorway wearing the same blue nightgown from last night. But something fundamental had changed. The light in her eyes was different. Dimmer, as if some essential part of her had died during the dark hours. I couldn't sleep, she said, moving slowly toward her chair at the kitchen table. I kept thinking about what you told me. About Claire and the car. About the lies. David wanted to hide the documents spread across the table. Wanted to protect her from learning how much worse things really were. But Margaret's eyes had already found the checkbook photo on his phone. What is that? David turned the phone face down. But it was too late. Margaret had seen enough to understand. She took money too, didn't she? The question hung in the air like smoke. Heavy with implications David didn't want to confirm. Truths that would make this betrayal complete. Mom, how much? The simple question contained a lifetime of hurt. A mother's need to know the full scope of her daughter's betrayal. To understand exactly how much her love had been worth in Claire's calculations. David picked up the insurance documents. Spread them carefully across the table. Let Margaret see the purchase price. The policy details. The exclusions that made recovery impossible. The car cost $59,000. The insurance won't pay because Claire wasn't authorized to drive it. Especially not while drinking. Margaret nodded slowly, as if confirming suspicions she'd harbored but hoped were wrong. And the checks? David showed her the photo. The evidence of forgery that went back months. Money stolen gradually, systematically, while Claire played the role of helpful daughter. At least $3,000. Maybe more. Margaret stared at the evidence with the expression of someone reading her own obituary. The final accounting of a life's worth. The arithmetic of love betrayed. $62,000, she said quietly. My entire savings. Everything I had left. The words fell into the kitchen like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread through every remaining day of Margaret's life. Changing everything forever. She planned this, Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. She didn't just steal impulsively. She studied me, learned my habits, figured out how to take everything without me noticing. David wanted to deny it. Wanted to believe that Claire's betrayal had been a moment of weakness rather than a calculated campaign. But the evidence was clear. The pattern was obvious. Claire had moved into their house with the specific intention of stealing everything Margaret owned. I'm calling the police, David said. They already called. Margaret gestured toward David's phone. I heard it ring. I know they have her. The calm in her voice was more frightening than tears would have been. This was the voice of someone who had moved past shock into something harder. Something that sounded like resolve. What do you want me to tell them? Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring at the documents that represented her destroyed dreams, her stolen independence, her daughter's complete betrayal of everything a family was supposed to mean. Tell them the truth, she said finally. All of it. The car, the money, the forgery, every lie she told and every dollar she stole. Mom, are you sure? Once I give them this evidence, there's no taking it back. Claire will be charged with serious crimes. She could go to prison. Margaret looked at David with eyes that held no tears. No regret. No mercy. She stole my life savings, David. She destroyed my independence. She lied to my face while robbing me blind. She chose gambling debts over her own mother's happiness. Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. More certain. More final. And when you caught her, she tried to make it your fault. Tried to paint you as the bad son for protecting me from her crimes. David had never heard Margaret speak about Claire with such clarity. Such cold assessment of character. Such complete absence of maternal forgiveness. She made her choices, Margaret continued. Now she can live with the consequences. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times. Normal time for normal people doing normal things. But this kitchen had become a courtroom. This table had become a place where justice was being decided by an elderly woman who had finally learned the true character of her daughter. David gathered the documents. Evidence of theft and forgery and the systematic exploitation of an elderly woman's trust. The paper trail that would send Claire to prison and give Margaret some small measure of justice. I'll drive to the station now. I'm coming with you. Mom, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Margaret's voice cut through his protest like steel. She stole from me. She betrayed me. She destroyed my dreams and my trust and my faith in family. Margaret stood slowly, supporting herself on the table edge. But there was nothing fragile about her movement. Nothing weak or uncertain. I want to look her in the eye when she learns that her victims aren't as helpless as she thought. David nodded, understanding that this wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about dignity. About an elderly woman reclaiming her power from someone who had tried to steal that too. About Margaret proving that love might be vulnerable to betrayal, but strength wasn't. They drove to the police station in David's Honda, the car that had seemed so ordinary next to Margaret's stolen SUV. But ordinary had its virtues. Ordinary meant honest, meant earned rather than stolen, meant the kind of modest success that didn't require destroying other people's dreams. The kind of life Claire had never learned to value. At the station, Detective Morrison was waiting. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the patient manner of someone who dealt with family crimes every day. Who understood that the worst betrayals often came from the people you loved most. Mrs. Davidson, she said gently. I'm sorry for your loss. I know this is difficult. Thank you, Margaret replied. But I'm not here for sympathy. I'm here for justice. The detective led them to a conference room where the evidence was spread across a table. Photos of the crashed SUV. Documents found in Claire's possession. Bank records showing the pattern of theft. Your daughter was legally drunk when the accident occurred, Detective Morrison explained. Blood alcohol content of 0.14. Nearly twice the legal limit. Margaret nodded calmly, as if this information simply confirmed what she already knew about her daughter's character. She also had these items in her possession. The detective indicated a plastic evidence bag, Margaret's spare house key, her credit cards, her social security card, everything someone would need to completely assume another person's identity. She wasn't just stealing from you, Mrs. Davidson. She was positioning herself to become you, to take over your entire financial life. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Claire hadn't just stolen a car and some money. She'd been planning to steal Margaret's entire existence. To become her. To erase her mother and assume her identity for financial purposes. What are the charges? Margaret asked. Grand theft auto, forgery, elder abuse, identity theft, DUI. She's looking at 5 to 10 years in state prison. Margaret absorbed this information without emotion, as if she was hearing a weather report rather than learning her daughter's fate. Good, she said simply. Some people need to be protected from her. If she won't control herself, the law will have to do it. David felt something shift inside his chest. Pride. His mother hadn't just survived this betrayal. She'd emerged from it stronger. More clear-eyed about the realities of family and trust and the price of misplaced loyalty. She'd learned that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was enabling. It was weakness disguised as virtue. It was the kind of false kindness that allowed evil people to destroy good ones. We'll need your testimony, Detective Morrison explained. Both of you, for the trial. You'll have it, Margaret said firmly. Every detail, every lie, every dollar she stole. They drove home in the afternoon sun. The evidence had been filed. The charges had been officially documented. The machinery of justice had begun its slow but inevitable progress. Claire would face trial, would probably be convicted, would serve time in prison for what she'd done to her own mother. Justice wouldn't return Margaret's money, wouldn't repair her shattered trust, wouldn't restore the beautiful car that had made her feel like she mattered. But it would prove something important. It would prove that elderly people weren't helpless victims, that families who preyed on their weakest members would be held accountable, that the law could step in where love had failed, that some betrayals were too large to forgive, too cruel to excuse, too evil to ignore. The courtroom felt like a cathedral. High ceilings, polished wood, the kind of formal architecture designed to make people feel the weight of justice. The importance of truth. David sat in the gallery behind Margaret, watching his mother's straight back as she prepared to testify against her own daughter. 3 months had passed since the night Claire destroyed Margaret's SUV and her dreams. 3 months of legal proceedings and depositions and the slow, methodical process of proving betrayal in a court of law. Claire sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit. The bright color made her skin look gray. Sickly. She'd lost weight in county jail. Lost the polished appearance that had helped her manipulate people for decades. Without her designer clothes and careful makeup, Claire looked exactly like what she was, a 58-year-old woman who had systematically destroyed her own family for money. The state calls Margaret Davidson to the stand. Margaret rose slowly from her seat in the front row. She wore her best navy dress, the one she'd bought for David's college graduation 30 years ago. Still elegant, still dignified, still the picture of a woman who had lived her life with integrity. The bailiff helped her navigate the steps to the witness stand. Her silver walker clicked softly against the marble floor. Each step deliberate, purposeful, the walk of someone who had made peace with difficult truths. Please state your name for the record. Margaret Elizabeth Davidson. Her voice carried clearly through the courtroom. Strong despite her 86 years. Unwavering despite the pain of what she was about to reveal. Mrs. Davidson, the prosecutor began gently, can you tell us about your relationship to the defendant? Margaret looked directly at Claire for the first time since entering the courtroom. Her face showed no emotion, no anger, no sadness, just the calm clarity of someone who had stopped lying to herself about family loyalty. She is my daughter. And can you tell us about the events of October 15th of last year? Margaret's testimony was precise, methodical. She described her Social Security back payment, the decision to buy a car, the joy of finally having something beautiful for herself after a lifetime of sacrifice. She spoke about Claire moving into their house 6 months earlier, about the gradual changes in their daily routine, about small things going missing, about feeling increasingly uncomfortable in her own home without understanding why. Did you give your daughter permission to use your vehicle? No. Did you give her access to your checkbook? No. Did you authorize any of the cash withdrawals shown in these bank records? Margaret looked at the documents the prosecutor held. Months of forged signatures. Thousands of dollars stolen while Margaret slept peacefully in her bed, trusting her daughter to protect rather than exploit her. No. Each answer fell like a hammer blow. Simple, direct, devastating. The defense attorney tried to create doubt during cross-examination. Suggested that Margaret might have given permission and forgotten. That elderly people sometimes had memory problems. That family finances were often informal arrangements that might be misunderstood. But Margaret was unshakable. "Young man," she said to the attorney, "I may be 86 years old, but I remember every penny I've earned and every dollar I've spent. I remember every check I've written and every withdrawal I've authorized. My daughter stole from me, systematically and deliberately, and I will not pretend otherwise to spare her the consequences of her choices." The courtroom was silent after that. Even Claire's attorney seemed to understand that attacking Margaret's credibility would only make his client look worse. David testified next. About finding the missing keys. About Claire's lies and evasions. About the pattern of manipulation and theft that had emerged over years of careful observation. He presented the insurance documents that proved Claire had no right to drive the car. The police reports that confirmed she'd been legally drunk during the accident. The evidence of forgery and identity theft that revealed the true scope of her crimes. Did you ever suspect your sister was stealing from your mother? David paused before answering. This was the question he'd dreaded. The one that forced him to admit his own failure to protect Margaret sooner. "I suspected she was taking advantage of Mom's generosity," he said finally. "But I didn't realize the extent of the theft until after the accident. I should have acted sooner. I should have protected my mother better. Why didn't you?" Another pause. David looked at Margaret, then at Claire, then back at the prosecutor. "Because she was my sister. Because I wanted to believe that family meant something to her. Because I confused enabling with loyalty." The truth of it hung in the courtroom like smoke. David had failed his mother by trusting his sister. Had enabled Claire's crimes through his own reluctance to face reality. Had chosen the comfort of denial over the difficulty of protection. But acknowledging failure was the first step toward preventing it from happening again. The trial lasted 3 days. Expert witnesses testified about elder abuse patterns. About the psychological manipulation used to exploit vulnerable adults. About the devastating impact of financial crimes on elderly victims. Financial experts calculated the full scope of Margaret's losses. Not just the car and the stolen checks, but the interest and investment income she would have earned. The security and independence those assets would have provided. The dignity that came from having resources to handle emergencies without becoming a burden on others. Claire had stolen more than money. She'd stolen Margaret's future. When it came time for Claire's testimony, she tried one last manipulation. Tears, apologies, claims of desperation and mental illness and circumstances beyond her control. "I love my mother," she sobbed into the microphone. "I never meant to hurt her. I was desperate. I had gambling debts. I thought I could pay everything back before she noticed." But the jury had heard the evidence. Had seen the pattern of deliberate planning. Had watched Margaret's dignified testimony about systematic betrayal. They weren't buying Claire's performance. The verdict came after 2 hours of deliberation, guilty on all counts. The judge's sentencing was swift and final: 7 years in state prison. Full restitution to Margaret. Permanent restraining order preventing Claire from contacting her mother. "Mrs. Davidson," the judge said, looking directly at Claire, "you systematically exploited the woman who gave you life. You betrayed every trust a daughter owes a mother. You stole not just money, but independence, dignity, and peace of mind from an elderly woman who had already sacrificed decades of her life for your benefit." Claire's shoulders shook with sobs. But whether from remorse or self-pity, David couldn't tell. Didn't care anymore. "Your crimes represent the worst kind of family betrayal," the judge continued. "They strike at the foundation of trust that allows families to function. They exploit the very love that should protect people from harm." The gavel fell with finality. Justice delivered. Consequences imposed. The law stepping in where family loyalty had failed. David helped Margaret gather her purse as the courtroom began to empty. Around them, people returned to their normal lives. Their normal problems. Their normal families where daughters didn't destroy mothers for gambling money. "How do you feel?" David asked as they walked slowly toward the exit. Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously, as if she was taking inventory of her emotional state for the first time in months. "Relieved," she said finally. "Not happy. Not satisfied. Just relieved." "Relieved? That it's over. That the truth is finally official. That I don't have to pretend anymore that she's someone she isn't." They walked out of the courthouse into the Chicago afternoon. The October air was crisp and clean, free of the stale atmosphere of legal proceedings and family betrayal. Margaret paused on the courthouse steps, looking back at the building where justice had been served, where her daughter had been held accountable for crimes that went beyond theft into something approaching cruelty. She had every advantage, Margaret said quietly. Love, support, education, opportunities I never had, and she chose to use all of it to hurt the people who cared about her most. David nodded, understanding that Margaret wasn't just talking about Claire's crimes. She was talking about the mystery of character, about how people raised with the same values could make such different choices, about the terrible truth that some people simply choose evil despite every reason to choose good. "I'm done trying to understand her," Margaret continued. "Done making excuses. Done hoping she'll change. She is what she is. And what she is dangerous to people who love her." They drove home in comfortable silence. The Honda's engine hummed steadily as suburban Chicago passed by the windows. Normal neighborhoods. Normal families. Normal lives proceeding without the drama of betrayal and theft and broken trust. At home, Margaret went to her room to rest. The trial had been exhausting. Not just physically, but emotionally. The work of facing hard truths and speaking them aloud and watching justice slowly, carefully, methodically sort good from evil. David sat in his study as evening fell over the house. The same room where he'd first seen the photos of Margaret's destroyed car. Where he'd realized the scope of Claire's betrayal. Where he'd started the long process of choosing truth over family loyalty. On his desk lay the final court documents. Verdict, sentencing, restitution order, the official record of justice served and family destroyed, and the price of trusting someone who had proven themselves untrustworthy. But there was something else on the desk. Something Margaret had given him after they'd returned from court. A new checkbook, a fresh start, a symbol of independence reclaimed and lessons learned, and the possibility of building something better from the ruins of what had been destroyed. Margaret would never get her money back. Would never again own anything as beautiful as that silver SUV. Would never again feel the particular joy of having something luxurious just for herself. But she'd gotten something else. Something more valuable than money or cars or material possessions. She'd gotten the truth. About family. About trust. About the difference between love and enabling. About the importance of protecting yourself from people who would hurt you, even when those people shared your blood. Especially when those people shared your blood. Outside, the October wind rustled through the trees Margaret had planted decades ago. Steady growth, patient investment, the long-term thinking that had built this house and this life and this family. A family that would now be smaller, safer, more honest about the reality of human nature and the limits of unconditional love. David closed the court documents and put them in the filing cabinet. Official record of the day justice was served and truth was acknowledged, and the consequences of betrayal were finally imposed. The day Margaret learned that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. The day David learned that protecting people you love sometimes means prosecuting people you love. The day they both learned that real family isn't about blood or shared history or unconditional loyalty. Real family is about choosing to protect each other. Choosing to tell the truth. Choosing to value integrity over convenience. Real family is what you build after you stop pretending that sharing DNA makes someone trustworthy. Spring came early to Chicago that year. By March, Margaret's garden was already showing signs of new life. Green shoots pushing through the dark soil. Daffodil bulbs Margaret had planted 30 years ago still returning faithfully each spring. Proof that some things endure. Some investments pay dividends for decades. David found Margaret on the back deck at 7 in the morning, coffee cup in hand, watching the sunrise paint her garden in shades of gold and green. She'd been waking earlier since the trial. Not from anxiety or sleeplessness, but from something that looked like peace. Like someone who had finally stopped carrying weight that had never been hers to bear. "Morning, Mom." "Good morning, dear." Margaret smiled without turning around. "Look at those tulips. I thought the frost might have killed them, but they're tougher than they appear." David followed her gaze to the flower bed along the back fence. Bright red tulips pushing through the last patches of snow. Fragile looking but resilient. Beautiful because they'd survived winter rather than despite it. "Coffee's fresh," Margaret added, settling back into her chair. "And there's something on the kitchen table for you." David poured his coffee and returned to the kitchen. On the table, next to Margaret's place setting, lay a manila envelope with his name written in Margaret's careful script. Inside were car registration papers. For a modest gray sedan parked in their driveway. A 4-year-old Honda Civic. Reliable, practical, the kind of car that would serve its owner faithfully for years without demanding attention or causing drama. The owner's name on the registration, Margaret Elizabeth Davidson. But at the bottom of the form, in the space for co-owner, Margaret had added David's name. Her signature fresh, final, permanent. David walked back to the deck with the papers in hand. "Mom, what is this?" "Independence," Margaret said simply. "Mine and yours." She gestured toward the driveway where the new car sat next to David's older Honda. Both modest, both honest, both symbols of transportation rather than status. "I used part of the restitution money," Margaret explained. "Not much. $28,000 for the car. The rest goes into a trust. For medical expenses, for home maintenance, for the things I might need as I get older." David studied the registration. Margaret's signature was clear and confident. No tremor, no hesitation. The handwriting of someone who had learned to make decisions based on need rather than want. On security rather than dreams. "You didn't have to add my name." "Yes, I did." Margaret's voice was firm. "Not because you can't afford your own car, but because this represents something different. This represents us choosing each other. Choosing to build something together instead of pretending blood alone makes family." David understood. This wasn't just about transportation. This was about partnership. About two people who had survived betrayal and chosen to trust each other going forward. About family defined by choice rather than accident of birth. "No more luxury SUVs," Margaret continued, taking a sip of her coffee. "No more dreams that can be stolen. Just reliable transportation and the freedom to go where I want to go." The words carried satisfaction, not bitterness or regret, but the solid contentment that comes from learning hard lessons and applying them wisely. "Where do you want to go?" Margaret smiled. The first genuinely happy smile David had seen from her since before Claire's betrayal. "The lake. But not for a picnic with ghosts. For a proper visit. To show your father what we've built. What we've survived. What we've learned." The lake where she'd honeymooned 62 years ago. Where she'd scattered their father's ashes. Where dreams had begun and ended and begun again. But this time, she wouldn't be going as a woman trying to recapture the past. She'd be going as someone who had faced the present and built a future worth driving toward. "When do we leave?" "After breakfast. I made egg salad sandwiches. Your father's favorite. But this time, they're for us." David looked at the registration papers again. The legal document that made them partners in this new beginning. Co-owners of something modest but honest. Something that couldn't be stolen because it had been earned through truth rather than manipulation. Inside the house, the phone rang. David started to get up, but Margaret waved him back down. "Let the machine take it. Unless it's an emergency, it can wait. Today is for driving, for remembering what it feels like to go somewhere just because you want to." They finished their coffee as the sun climbed higher over the suburban morning. Normal sounds surrounded them. Birds in Margaret's trees, lawn mowers in distant yards. The comfortable rhythm of people beginning their days without drama or crisis or the weight of family betrayal. The phone had stopped ringing. The message light would blink until David checked it later. But Margaret was right. Today was for something else. Today was for using their new independence to visit the place where love stories began. They packed sandwiches in an old wicker basket Margaret had used for family picnics when David and Claire were children. Before Claire learned to see family gatherings as opportunities for manipulation. Before trust became a weapon rather than a gift. But there would be no ghosts on this picnic. No memories of betrayal or stolen dreams. Just an 86-year-old woman and her son, driving to a lake in a reliable car they owned together. The drive took 43 minutes. Country roads lined with farms where spring planting had begun. Ordinary landscapes that looked beautiful simply because they were being seen by people who had learned to value ordinary joys. Margaret navigated from memory, her directions clear and confident. Left at the red barn. Right at the church with the white steeple. Straight through the town that had grown from village to suburb but still maintained its small-town character. There, she said finally, pointing to a gravel road that curved down toward the water. Lake Harmony. Still the most peaceful place on earth. They parked in the same spot where Margaret and her husband had stopped for their honeymoon picnic 6 decades earlier. The lake stretched before them, blue-green water reflecting white clouds and spring sky. Unchanged despite everything that had happened in the world since two young people had spread a blanket here and promised to love each other forever. Margaret got out of the car slowly but without difficulty. Her movements were careful but determined. The movements of someone who had learned the difference between being cautious and being afraid. He would have liked this car, she said, running her hand along the sedan's modest lines. Practical, reliable, the kind of purchase that makes sense rather than making a statement. They found a bench overlooking the water. The same bench, Margaret claimed, where she'd sat with David's father during their last visit before his death. Where they'd held hands and watched sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and pink. "Do you miss him?" David asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment, watching a family of ducks paddle near the shore. "Every day, but not the way I used to. Not with the desperate sadness that made missing him feel like drowning. Now I miss him the way you miss summer in winter. With the certainty that something beautiful existed and gratitude that I was part of it." She unpacked the sandwiches with steady hands. Egg salad on wheat bread. Simple food for a simple pleasure. No attempt to recreate the luxury that had been stolen. Just nourishment shared between people who had chosen to trust each other. "I learned something during the trial," Margaret said as they ate. "About the difference between love and enabling. About how protecting people sometimes means stopping other people from hurting them." David nodded. He'd learned the same lesson. That real love required boundaries. That family loyalty without accountability was just another form of cruelty. That protecting someone from consequences wasn't kindness, it was an invitation to repeat harmful behavior. "Claire called from prison last week." David looked up sharply. This was the first mention of Claire since the sentencing 6 months ago. "What did she say?" "That she's sorry. That she's getting help for her gambling addiction. That she hopes I'll forgive her and visit her and maybe put some money in her commissary account." Margaret's voice was calm as she related this. Matter of fact. As if she was discussing weather rather than her daughter's attempt at renewed manipulation. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing. I hung up. And then I called the prison and asked them to block her calls." Some people change. Some people learn. Some people deserve second chances. Margaret wrapped the remaining sandwich carefully before continuing. "And some people are exactly who they've always shown themselves to be. Claire is 58 years old. She's had dozens of second chances. She's shown me her character consistently for decades. I'm done pretending she might suddenly become someone different." The finality in Margaret's voice was complete. This wasn't anger or temporary disappointment. This was the settled conclusion of someone who had examined evidence carefully and reached a verdict based on facts rather than hopes. "You don't feel guilty about cutting her off?" "I felt guilty for 30 years about enabling her. About making excuses for her. About protecting her from consequences that might have taught her better choices. I'm done feeling guilty about finally learning from my mistakes." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the lake reflect the afternoon sky. Around them, spring was asserting itself with quiet determination. New leaves unfurling, flowers blooming, life continuing its eternal cycle of growth and renewal. "You know what I realized?" Margaret said eventually. "What's that?" "I spent 63 years working, saving, planning for a future where I'd have something beautiful. Something that would prove my life had mattered. Something that would make me feel like I deserved nice things." She gestured toward their modest car. Their simple picnic. Their ordinary afternoon at an unremarkable lake. But the beautiful thing was never going to be a car. It was going to be this. Sitting by water with someone I love. Someone who chose to protect me instead of exploit me. Someone who tells me the truth even when it's difficult. Margaret reached over and patted David's hand. The beautiful thing was always going to be family. Real family. The kind you build through choices rather than inherit through biology. David felt something shift in his chest. A weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. The weight of trying to maintain loyalty to someone who had never been loyal in return. The exhausting work of pretending that shared DNA created obligations that transcended basic human decency. I love you, Mom. I love you too, son. And that's enough. That's more than enough. They drove home as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The Honda ran smoothly, its engine humming with reliable efficiency. No dramatic statement of luxury or status. Just transportation that would serve its purpose faithfully for years to come. At home, Margaret went to her room to rest. The day had been full but not exhausting. Satisfying in the way that simple pleasures often were. Rich with the contentment that came from choosing happiness over drama, truth over convenient lies. David sat in his study as darkness fell over the house. On his desk were the car registration papers. Legal documents that made him and Margaret co-owners of something modest but honest. Something that represented partnership rather than possession. He signed his name on the final line with steady hands. The signature of someone who had learned the difference between loyalty and enabling. Between love and manipulation. Between family and the people who happen to share your blood. Outside, suburban Chicago settled into its evening rhythm. Porch lights flickering on. Television screens glowing blue behind curtains. Ordinary families living ordinary lives where love was expressed through protection rather than exploitation. Where trust was earned rather than assumed. Where family was defined by choice rather than accident. Margaret's garden rustled in the spring breeze. Plants she'd tended for decades returning faithfully each year. Proof that some investments paid dividends for a lifetime. That some things endured when they were cared for properly. That some relationships grew stronger when they were based on truth rather than obligation. David put the registration papers in the filing cabinet next to the court documents from Claire's trial. Official records of the day justice was served and the day independence was reclaimed. The paper trail of a family that had learned to value integrity over blood ties. In the kitchen, he found a note from Margaret on the table. Thank you for today. For choosing truth over comfort. For protecting me when I couldn't protect myself. For teaching me that real family is what we build together, not what we inherit separately. Love, Mom. David read the note twice before folding it carefully and putting it in his wallet. Next to his Medicare card. Next to the driver's license that now listed him as co-owner of a modest gray sedan. Documentation of a life lived honestly. Of choices made with integrity rather than convenience. Of family defined by love rather than biology. Life doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything I went through means something today. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your words might become the seed of the next chapter we create together. Thank you for spending